So the Mahone Bay Center is situated on unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We acknowledge the peace and friendship treaties and commit to working in harmony with Indigenous people, being informed by their knowledge and wisdom. We also respect the right of Indigenous people to be consulted. Tonight's event is part of a series supported by the Healthy Bays Network to launch the book Salmon Wars, the Dark Underbelly of Our Favorite Fish. Tonight's gathering is sponsored by the social chapter of the Council of Canadians and the Twin Bays Coalition, and there are tables at the back where there's more information. For those of you who are regular attendees at Council of Canadians events, you know we have these little flower buckets that we have available for people to make donations, and that money is used to just cover our costs. But tonight, we have information on the Healthy Bays fundraising campaign. And for more information on that, you can talk to Jeff. And unfortunately, in order for community voices to be a part of the regulation of open net pens, we have to participate in a very litigious system. And that system, of course, has lawyers funded by our tax dollars and by the industry. So in order for our voices to be heard, the voices of the community, we have to raise money. So thank you for your anticipated generosity. Tonight's proceedings are being live streamed, and I think it's now on the social chapter of the Council of Canadians website.
Yeah, I think it may not be, so we're recording it instead and we'll put it up later.
Oh, okay. And at any rate, you could access it through our website or through the Twin Bays Coalition, so you can tell your friends if they were unable to be here. The cameras are stationary, and I think you're all behind them. What I was going to say is that if you didn't want to be in a shot, make sure that you're behind the camera. The washrooms are down the stairs, and the exits are there's one this way that takes you to the back of the building, and one in the front where many of you probably came in. Just a quick run through for the program. We're going to start off with a provincial overview of what's happening with aquaculture in finfish farming in Nova Scotia. And then we're going to hear from a resident who's resisting and lives nearby an open net pen farm. If there's time, we'll have a few questions, but then there will be a break, and Catherine Collins and Doug FRANTZ, who are sitting at the front here, are very happy to sign books. And there's also information at the table that you might be interested in, and also lots of socializing is always a good thing. So after the break, Catherine and Doug will provide highlights from the book. So they'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then Chris Hyde will interview them around topics in the book. We hope at the end to have time for questions, and during that time, we're asking people to line up in the center aisle, just because that way we get the questions recorded on the live stream. Also, I think if people have cell phones, if you could please mute them or turn them off, whatever happens. Apparently in this room there's a weird thing about frequencies, and things go a little wonky. So that's what we're up to tonight. So I'll introduce Simon and John, if you want to come up. Simon Ryder-Burbidge works for the Ecology Action Center on the Marine team, where he does campaign work, community engagement, works on aquaculture policy. And we in the Healthy Bays Network have the good fortune of having Simon assigned to work with us. At this time, I'd also like to mention that the Atlantic Salmon Federation has also committed staff time to the Healthy Bays Network, and that's been a real help to us. John McDonald is a coastal resident living really close to open net pens. He's a longtime resident of Bayswater, and for the last few years, he's been working to hold someone accountable for the negative effects of the Saddle Island site, which is in his community. So without further introduction, thank you, John and Simon, and it's over to you.
All right, well, thanks very much, Marilyn. Can everyone hear me okay if I go without the mic?
Yeah.
Yes, thumbs up in the back there, great. So yeah, I'm starting us off today. You're going to hear all kinds of nasty business in relation to open net pen finfish farming. What I'm going to take you through today is what's happening in our province. It's called fish farming in Nova Scotia, moving in the wrong direction. I think by the time the evening is done here, you'll be well acquainted with the reasoning behind why we want to not only put a cap on the number of net pens that exist in this province today, but also why we want to start moving them out of the water. And Chris is helping me here with the slideshow, so we can go to the next one there, Chris. So as Marilyn mentioned, I work for the Ecology Action Centre. I'm the aquaculture campaign lead over there. We do a range of stuff from law and policy work to community organizing and advocacy, kind of all across the spectrum of organizing on environmental issues. And this has been my beat for the last few years now. I've had the pleasure of becoming very well acquainted with open net pen finfish farms myself. What we've got happening in Canada at the moment is really a tale of two coasts. In British Columbia, we have commitments from the federal government to start moving open net pen finfish farms out of the water, and that came about through a 2019 campaign commitment that the Liberals made on the back of a lot of environmental and social organizing on the West Coast. Wild salmon populations out west have been decimated in the past couple of decades. And while there are many reasons for that, one of the major culprits is open net pen finfish farming, and there are a lot of reasons for that you'll hear about tonight. So with that federal mandate over here on the East Coast, we were thinking to ourselves, well, look, it's federal policy now. If it's happening on one coast, surely the same commitment to move net pens out of the water must be making its way east. Chris, if you can go to the next one. Unfortunately, we find quite the opposite occurring. So we're in a situation in Nova Scotia here where basically the burden of impact that's occurring out west, where they farm the most open net pen salmon anywhere in Canada, is moving over here to our waters. And we're in a situation now where we have industry commitments that would quadruple the amount of open net pen salmon farmed in our bays and coasts today. At the moment, we're kind of a middling province when it comes to open net pen fish farming. We do about 20 million pounds, or 20 million pounds today, which is the smallest of the Atlantic fish farming provinces behind New Brunswick and Newfoundland. But industry commitments, as they exist now, should they be seen through fruition, would multiply that number up to 80 million pounds.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Could we dim the lights, if possible, dim lights in front?
Is it possible to dim lights?
Oh.
I think it's front, is asking for a front here.
It's just shining on the screen.
Yeah, that's
That-
good.
that-
better.
Cinematic.
Yeah. Well, maybe leave the back ones on. Turn the back ones
Does that work okay?
Just leave the back.
This is the one that's the problem.
This is the one that's the problem in the middle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Okay, that's okay.
Don't go to sleep.
Okay, great. So that's better. Sorry, Chris, we can just go back one and then we'll move forward in a sec. So we have two companies that are the primary commitments to this expansion. One is the known entity in this region. It's Cook Aquaculture. They're a $2.4 billion international corporation based out of Blacks Harbor, New Brunswick initially, but they now have fish farming operations everywhere from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, to Maine, to Scotland, to Washington State, etc. And they also have a vast array of wild capture fisheries across the world as well, and they've basically vertically integrated the entire seafood supply chain, everything from feed mills to the fish themselves, to the feed fish, to producing the salmon, etc. And then the second company is a newer addition to the province called Hogland Groupin. They've rebranded for Canada as Canadian Salmon, and they've proposed 4 huge sites in the St. Mary's Bay down the Dixie Neck. The 4 largest, these would be the 4 largest salmon farm sites in the province at 80 hectares apiece. So we can hit the next one, Chris. Thank you. So 80 million pounds of net pen salmon. It's hard to picture what that looks like in your mind, of course. This is a photograph. This is a map image of New Brunswick. So New Brunswick gets us half of the way there. They do about 40 million pounds of salmon today, and this is kind of like the broad swath of the fish farming region of New Brunswick, southwestern New Brunswick, where they do all this production. I'm sure many of you know the region, but maybe an hour drive from the eastern part of the map to the western part of the map. So this is to help folks get a sense of like the scale of operation that we're looking at. Many of these sites are smaller than the ones that we do and will have in Nova Scotia, but I think it just kind of paints a picture of the sort of fundamental change that occurs in one's coastline when you're committed to that number of farmed salmon. The other thing to keep in mind here is that the provincial government of Nova Scotia is committed to doing a coastal classification system. And so what that means is they're going to designate certain areas of the province either red, yellow, or green. The red will be the no-go zones where they think that open net pen salmon is not appropriate. Yellow will be proceed with caution. And then green is like the green areas are if industry and government get their way, likely to look something like this, although of course not perfectly like this, different scales and sizes of fish farms, but the point is there will be concentrated areas throughout our province over the next few years that are likely to host many of these proposals. And we're seeing that now in Liverpool Bay with huge expansions proposed there, and as I mentioned, St. Mary's Bay down the Digby Neck as well. Where these other green areas might land, we don't know yet. To the next. What does 80 million pounds look like from an environmental standpoint? This is something you'll hear a lot from Doug and Catherine about as well. Some of the stuff that we deal with at the Ecology Action Centre are these impacts. Primarily tragic impacts to the wild salmon populations that we have left here in the province. These are cherished fish to people who got a chance to know them and understand them, and populations that are now heavily diminished. In some cases, we have rivers where we have some rivers on the mainland where salmon populations are completely depleted, others that hang on by a thread, and by that I mean 7, 10, 15 fish populating certain rivers, including a federally listed species at risk population called the Inner Bay of Fundy salmon, where an aquaculture escape was recently found in a home river up on the Gasborough in the valley. And so on that river where we have just a handful of salmon remaining, a single escape interbreeding with that population is enough to cause, essentially that can cause the end of that population. And that kind of covers introgression in the middle there. That's the interbreeding of wild and farmed salmon. So when farmed salmon are produced for consumption, and wild salmon are produced to do what wild salmon do, and race upriver and breed and live their lives in a wild way. And when those two kinds of salmon meet in open water and upriver, they do interbreed, and they interbreed frequently. And we know now that something like 10% of a population comprised of escapes is enough for that population level decline to occur. And we're seeing that right now in an active way up on Conn River in Newfoundland, where there's a major aquaculture, open net pen aquaculture expansion happening in an active wild salmon river, or outside of it, I should say. The other major issues here, I'll just point to a couple. Sea lice. These little guys breed by the millions at open net pen sites where the fish are produced in cramped conditions, and it's perfect for pests to reproduce. These little lice follow farm salmon around basically any place they're produced. It's especially bad in New Brunswick, in that area where I showed the map from before, where in some cases they have recorded upwards of 40 sea lice per fish, which is kind of insane. I mean, in some cases you're talking about salmon farming sites that have 600,000 or 900,000 individual farmed salmon on the site. So I can't do that kind of math. That blows my brain right apart, but that's a lot of sea lice, and of course they don't stay in the open net pens. They flow freely into the open water, where they then attach themselves to wild salmon and who knows what other fish. And I should mention as well, 2 to 4 sea lice we know now from Norway is enough to, 4 sea lice is enough to kill a wild smolt, like a little baby salmon. So of course, these guys being produced in the millions is no good for those populations. A couple others, disease, very common. Same reason, cramped conditions. ISAV is a very prominent disease in our region, where the salmon look like that and have all kinds of internal organ issues. Die-off happens frequently because of either any number of reasons. Could be sea lice, could be disease, could be heat and hot water. Like this time of year in particular tends to be really bad. This is a shot from Newfoundland, 2019, when there was a significant heat event there, and more than 2.5 million farmed salmon died in a single mortality event, which is like alarming and of course very inappropriate for anybody who knows animal husbandry will tell you that that's completely unacceptable. But unfortunately, that kind of thing happens routinely here. And then the two kind of obvious ones, waste product. You're talking about mass amounts of uneaten feed that are left to sink to the bottom. You're talking about feces that are left to sink to the bottom at scales that are kind of unfathomable. And creating deoxygenation at the seafloor, essentially. And that can mean anything from a decrease in localized biodiversity to a complete dead zone. And then loss of fishing grounds, of course. So that picture that I showed you of the map in New Brunswick, those fish farms altogether use up about 2,000 hectares of space, and that is space that would be used traditionally for lobster fishing or other kinds of fishing. Essentially, it's a de facto privatization of public waters, which which is really a problem, especially for fishing communities and other communities that are active in those areas. And to the next. The other reason we're going the wrong direction is because the future is on land. And we have two companies now in Nova Scotia, Sustainable Blue and Cap d'Or, that are producing perfectly delicious farmed salmon indoors in enclosed containment tanks where disease and sea lice cannot escape, where water temperature can be monitored, and where essentially all of the environmental costs that we just looked at are taken care of by this improvement in technology. And so it just moves the cost of this farming practice onto the industry to do it this way, rather than the environment paying a significant subsidy for industry to produce these fish. And the reason that we're seeing this scaling up in open net pens here is because we're one of the last. We have a lax regulatory system and a cheap leasing rate that makes it easy for companies to come in, farm very cheaply, pollute the waters, and get out with a huge profit margin. On land, very good progress is being made. We're up to 88 companies globally. These numbers actually get out of date basically every week because there's a new investor trying to spin one of these land-based salmon farms up. The important number here, 2 billion by 2028. The current market for all farmed salmon today is about 2.7 billion. So if these projections are correct, land-based salmon is going to account for almost the equivalent of all the salmon that's consumed today. which is massive. And the decreasing costs at land-based facilities likely mean that at some point, certainly not today, but at some point, there is a chance that these fish will not only be much more sustainable, but actually more affordable. And to the next. So what is going on in Nova Scotia? You're going to hear about this from John as well. But we have a province that acts both as a regulator and a promoter. And we've had just this push from a series of successive provincial governments to expand this industry. I think they see dollar signs in other areas, in other regions, and other countries, and it's been very hard to get provincial governments to let go of this industry that people in coastal communities simply don't support. And you know, I'm sure that there are some people in this room who are familiar with the vast opposition to CERMAC Canada's 2020 development plans for the region here. That was just one showing of many that occurred in Nova Scotia at that time, and that have occurred, you know, as early as 15 years prior, opposing these huge fish farm developments. But we were stuck fighting the same fight over and over and over. And so, on to the next, Chris. We're saying at the end of the day, let communities decide. I mean, I work for an environmental organization, and to me, the environmental costs of this industry are simply unacceptable. You know, reasonable people, I think, should have the right to disagree on that fact. If there are communities where this is a fit, you know, they should be able to at least have an option rather than having these fish farms, you know, like we see today. We see communities where fish farms are essentially shoved down the throats of residents and of communities, including in cases where municipal councils have made statements in opposition to these kind of developments, and still, in some cases, we see them kind of getting railroaded. And there's a lot of work to do on that front to clean up the way that the decision-making process works here. And we're not going to get into the details of that today, but at the end of the day, what we're saying to people is, what we're saying to our government is, you know, let the people decide. I mean, we feel very confident in what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years that this industry is not right for Nova Scotians, and this industry is not right for coastal communities, at least the ones that we work with closely. And at the end of the day, we're calling on our political leaders to finally listen to what coastal communities have to say. We also had a promise to basically have that very consultation during the election campaign leading up to the Conservative victory, the PC victory. And the government has since backed away from that campaign promise. They were going to consult all of us on whether or not we should cap the new development of open net pen fin fish farms. And what we got instead was a regulatory review that we've now been participating in, which is essentially meant to be a series of tweaks to the regulatory system that currently governs this industry. And at the end of the day, it's clear as day that it's not the regulatory system that's the issue, it's the technology itself. And it's right in the name, open net pens. And there's no amount of regulation that you can put upon this industry to solve those environmental issues. So if we're saying that we're expanding this industry, then we're preparing ourselves to live with all of that fallout that we've just touched on. So that's it for me. I mean, there's a lot more to say, and I'm happy to answer any questions tied to the province, I think after a couple of other presentations. But at this moment, I'm going to pass it on to John, and he's going to give you the an up close and personal presentation on what it's like to live near one of these things. So, on to you, John.
Thanks, Simon. Got a pointer. Thanks everybody for coming out and.
Can people hear?
Public. So 4 years after it was submitted and 2 years after the expansion took place, they let us know that it was happening. Just to give you an idea of the size, they're telling us that there's 440,000 fish out there, and the target harvest weight of salmon is somewhere around 5 kilos. So if you do the math, the biomass is equivalent to about 30,000 people, or about 115,000 beavers. And I'll get to that. I'll get back to that in a minute, actually. The next slide. So, as far as waste goes, Simon mentioned that they produce a lot of weight. Well, I've been working with members of the scientific community who have ways of calculating how much each fish produces, and with 440,000 fish out there, that's about 240,000 kilos per year, or about 22 tandem dump truck loads of waste being dumped right in the middle of Bayswater, our community. And I did some math to show over the 25 years that works out to about 6 million kilos, or 545 dump truck loads. So the question is, where do they think it's all going? You know, and I'm going to show you where we think it's going. So this is a kind of a fairly simple sketch that I did, but has a lot of really good information about the site in Bayswater. So it shows you how, this is about 1 kilometer from the open net pen farm. This is the application that they put in to expand it to this size. This is their legal lease size here. And you can see the expansion took place where they now have 2 of the pens operating clearly outside of their legal lease. And we tried to get the government to enforce their own regulations and do something about this. And they didn't, they refused. In fact, the quote in the paper, because this is not the only site operating outside of its boundaries, they said no harm, no foul. Well, I'm going to show you that there is some harm. What else is on here? Well, this is the 2 current studies that were done in 2015 and 2016, and they show that the current is moving from the open net pen towards the beach. You can see that it's all sand, this whole area. In fact, on their site evaluation, it's about 95% sand. And that's not good, because sand is classified as non-cohesive, meaning stuff like salmon farm waste doesn't stick to it. It can be resuspended during storms with big ocean swells and things like that. So you can dump, 20-something truckloads of waste there over the summer and have a big storm come and resuspend, I don't know, 5 or 10 truckloads in one event. And then it's into the water column with the currents flowing towards the beach. So you don't have to be much of a scientist to figure out, what was likely happening in Bayswater. One other thing I want to point out here is when you live close to a beach, which we have for over 30 years, beaches change from winter to summer. If you went to the beach right now, there's 3 or 4 feet of sand over top of what's there in the winter and spring beach. That sand is starting now transitioning from its summer conditions to fall, winter, and it's all going to move out into this big, what the term I heard used was a barrage of sand that's out there. So that's going to stay out there all winter, and next summer it's going to come back in again. So we believe that the waste that's been accumulated, it's an accumulation effect of waste, is getting mixed in with this barrage of sand, and it's bringing it onto Bayswater Beach. So next slide, please. So this is some data that was taken from the government website. These are the pollution levels that are around the satellite of the site, but it's only within the lease. They only measure the pollution levels within the lease. So this red dotted line represents the maximum that they're allowed to have out there before they have to take mitigation action. And you can see that they've exceeded that maximum line multiple times over the last 10 to 12 years. And it's interesting because these high readings are all happening during the summer. That's when they do their first set of readings. The level 1 readings are done usually in July or August. And if they're high, they have to come back after the winter and take more readings. And all these low readings are done after winter storms. Essentially, nature has flushed the toilet in Bayswater for them. And one other thing I want to point out here is this 3,000 mark, that is double what is allowed in British Columbia. So why? Why are we polluting at double the rate of British Columbia? Next slide, please. So this is really interesting. This is an actual core sample taken from a site, and it obviously looks like a sand bottom, similar to Bayswater. You can see from the picture, and this is really interesting because you can see the stratification that's occurred where kind of normal looking sand has covered up the black, heavier sediment. And that's really important because look at the next slide. That was, can you switch there please? This was a picture that was taken in February of 2018, the same day that the Department of Environment inspector from Bridgewater came to Bayswater Beach because we called them when we were seeing stuff like this on the beach. And you know, we've been there 30 years. We've never seen anything like this before. And I put a quote from I got a copy of the report. So this is one of the quotes from the report. And this picture was taken the same day. So obviously, that's very misleading in a lot of ways, and very concerning when an inspector goes to a beach and puts this in writing, when this was the actual conditions on the beach. And very similar to the last slide that I showed you with the stratification of the black material and the sand. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures now that have been taken over the last 2 years to show you how long that this has actually been going on in Bayswater. This was taken a couple of weeks after Hurricane Teddy. And what happens during big storms is it strips sand off the beach. So if there was, 6 or 8 inches of sand over top of this stuff, the storm removes it all and exposes it to the air. And I can tell you, as bad as that looks, the smell on Bayswater Beach was unbelievable. A very strong sewer-like. I don't know if you ever smelled a septic tank with the cover off of it, what that smells like. Well, that's what Bayswater Beach smelled like, and it stayed like that for months. It was just unbelievable. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting slide because this was taken in April 2021 while the province was allowing the farm to be restocked. So this was the condition on the beach, and the farm was being restocked. So you have to ask yourself, like, what kind of regulations, or what are we doing here in this province when we have situations like this going on? And you can see there's no seaweed here. It's just black. And next slide, please. This was from last winter, after a storm. Okay, next slide, please. Now this is really interesting here because this was in April of this year, late April. A storm removes a lot of sand. This is not unusual with beaches. And so I want to point out these 2 boulders right here. You can see there's no sand or seaweed or anything in front of them. And 3 weeks later, on the long weekend, I went down to the beach. So show the next slide, please. There's what it looks like. There's the boulders right there. And that's what I saw on the beach. So I invited some retired government sedimentologists down to the beach to have a look at this. And I showed them the pictures, like there was nothing there 3 weeks ago. And now we've got all this. And they said there's only one place where it can be coming from. And this was a quote from an email I received recently from the Department of Environment in Bridgewater. So their official position on this is that it's being caused by beavers and seaweed, right? I mean, so I don't know how many beavers they think are in Bayswater, but look at it. This was a long weekend. Imagine there was kids, and I live very close. I can walk here in 5 minutes. So I go down there fairly regularly to have a look. And there's kids who are down there digging in this stuff. It's unbelievable. So next slide, please. So this is just a summary of what we've got going on in Bayswater. So we have very shallow water. The farm is located in, one end is about 50 feet of water and the other end is about 60 feet. Very light currents. They're about half of what they think is suitable for an open net pen fish farm. The waters are increasingly getting warmer every year, forcing them to run aeration generators just to keep the fish alive. And it was interesting this year, they stopped feeding the fish for weeks in Bayswater, while the water temperature was up around 18, 19 degrees. So I think they were worried. Salmon anyway, they stop eating once the temperature goes above 18, 19 degrees. And we've got resuspension happening, like happened during Hurricane Teddy. We are going to have another hurricane this weekend. Now the wind direction is going to be a little different, so I'm not sure if we're going to see the same effects, but it's possible that we will. This is the last picture. Now this was taken by one of my neighbors. This was in May, and obviously you can see the service boat out here at the site, and look at the slick coming off of the farm, and the beach is that way, so it's heading towards the beach. So you got to ask yourself, what are they dumping in the water out there? Do they have a sea lice problem at the Saddle Island site? Maybe, but you'll never hear anything about it because it's offshore. So, you know, when you live close to an open net pen fish farm and a beach, you see a lot of things, a lot of changes that occur that you wouldn't normally see if you drive down through Bayswater. You'll see the fish farm, you maybe walk on the beach, but if there's a couple of inches of sand over top of all that black stuff I showed you, you'd never know it was there. But it makes up the entire base of the beach now. I know. So that's all I wanted to show everybody, and thanks for coming out, and thanks to Doug and Catherine for writing this very important book, and I can't wait to hear from you guys.
And of course, Andra's there with more books to sell. So we'll come back in no more than 10 minutes. And at the end, we'll hopefully have a bit of time for questions. So get your questions ready and get lined up for the end.
Open net salmon farms. And I do want to thank the Council of Canadians on behalf of myself and Catherine and the Twin Bays Coalition and the Healthy Bays Network for inviting us, and all of you, thank you for coming. It feels like we've come full circle because this very room was where we were inspired to write this book. There were a lot more people here then, but that was pre-COVID. So thank you all very much then, and I hope that we as we were inspired by the people who spoke here in January 2020, we hope that we can in some small way provide some inspiration to you in your fight against open net salmon farms here in Nova Scotia, in the Maritimes, and beyond, because this is a global problem and they're only going to be ultimately global solutions. And so with that, I'm going to have Catherine show you the global scope of this problem.
Okay. I'm a little afraid of this thing. I'd like to ditto Doug's thanks and also acknowledge the enormous amount of work that several people in this room have put into this issue over the years, long before we got involved in it a couple of years ago. So thank you very much. So we're here to talk about all the issues that this $20 billion a year industry does not want you to know. After salmon farming took off in the 1970s in Norway and then moved beyond around the globe, people were hopeful that these salmon farms might in fact help prevent the decline of wild salmon worldwide. They also hoped that this might help solve the growing global protein crisis. Even the Atlantic Salmon Federation, which was founded in the 1940s to help protect the wild salmon, even those people were hopeful. They were conducting research into ways to farm salmon responsibly, sustainably, and protect those wild salmon. They realized very quickly that this just was not the answer. It wasn't the answer then, and it isn't the answer now. And here are the issues that illustrate this. And the first is the waste. A typical salmon farm, one containing up to 1 million fish, held in a dozen cages, produces fecal matter roughly the equivalent of a town of 65,000 people. The difference, of course, is that town will process its waste. A salmon farm, however, will drop that waste right onto the seabed below. Oh, and could we please have a photo? I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be cueing my own photos. The yardstick. There you go. This is a photo taken right here in Nova Scotia by Kathy Brush, and it is of a salmon farm. 32 inches, now I can't see, buried in the muck below. And then following that is a chart produced by Inka Malinsky about the waste and how the whole waste process works. After waste, you have the issue of the mortality rates. Worldwide, year after year, 15 to 20% of farmed salmon die in open net pen fish farms. They die from viruses, warming ocean temperatures, and a parasite called a sea lice. Factory chicken and industrial cows, on the other hand, die at the rate of 5 and 3% in comparison. But we have even worse numbers right here in the Maritimes. In 2019, 10 farms owned by the Norwegian company Maui, or as they would pronounce it, Mowi, lost 2.6 million fish in one die-off. That year, they lost more fish than they harvested in Newfoundland. And the years since, it hasn't improved. The die-off rate in Newfoundland has remained just below 50%. in the years since 2009, 3 years since 2019. I can't think of another industry that would accept that sort of losses. And finally, I call this, just because they say it so doesn't make it true. Here are 2 examples of how this industry uses deceptive practices to, in other words, known as marketing. In 2020, there were 2 lawsuits filed against Mahone for its claims it made about its duck-trapped smoked salmon as all-natural, sustainably sourced, and raised, these are quotation marks from their promotional material, raised on the coast of Maine. In fact, Maui's own audits made it clear that the farms providing salmon to duck trap used pesticides, antibiotics, and other chemicals to treat their fish, which came from Canada, which came from Norway, and most troubling, from Chile. The company settled for $1.3 million, which is no more than a rounding error for this company. But it did require, this lawsuit did require the company to remove from its marketing words like sustainable, organic, naturally raised. And we'll come back to this idea of come back to this in what we call controlling the narrative later. Another example of the industry's deceptive practices involves feed. According to the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, 1 billion people around the world do not get enough protein in their diets. The aquaculture industry likes to wrap itself in this mantle of being able to solve this worldwide crisis. But there's no way around this basic fact that salmon are carnivores, and it takes about 1.5 kilos of feed to raise 1 kilo of salmon. It used to be worse. It used to be 3 to 1. But they've made some minor improvements with the addition of veggies, which salmon don't much like. In the wild, juvenile salmon eat insects, and when they're older, they begin their epic migration to Greenland, across the Atlantic. They eat fish such as krill and herring. And even though farm salmon are raised in captivity, they are still carnivores, and their feed must be comprised of a very specific type of protein. Currently, the companies that make the feed to meet that specific need for protein use wild forage fish, and much of that wild fish is caught off the west coast of Africa, where half the fisheries right now are in a state of collapse. The industry calls these fish they're taking from off the west coast of Africa trash fish, but they're not. They're fish that are normally eaten by human beings. Bottom line, these huge trawlers are taking fish out of the sustenance fisheries, the markets, and the dinner tables along the 3,400-kilometer long coast of West Africa in order to feed our farmed Atlantic salmon that we eat in our restaurants and on Sunday evening dinners. And you're going to go on?
Okay.
Okay. From there, here.
Here.
Sorry. It's a dance.
And that, by the way, is a trawler off the coast of West Africa with a haul of trash fish to be used, ground up into fish meal and fish oil to feed salmon, to put them on our plates and the plates of other middle-class people. I want to talk to you a little bit about how we did this book and how we've worked. We are investigators by skill and by mindset. And we started out here not to judge the industry, but to follow the facts and see where they led us. And so how did we do that? We started by reading many, many science journal articles about this topic, everything we could find, along with the work of other journalists and activists over the past 20 years who've been involved in this issue. We examined court cases. We filed requests with the government of Canada and the United States government for access to information. Those were very successful, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Building on those foundations, we interviewed more than 100 people. We talked to environmentalists, we talked to scientists, physicians, lawyers, people who work in aquaculture. We did not talk to the industry because they refused to talk to us. Cermak, no. Cook Aquaculture, no. Maui, no. They refused to submit to any interviews. They refused to answer any questions. Catherine's going to explain the reasoning that we discovered behind that in just a few minutes. But let me name a few of the people who helped shape this book, because reading journals, gathering facts is one thing, but going out and talking to people who have been involved in this issue, people whose passions and commitment through their passion and commitment have devoted a lifetime to this issue, Those are the people who really make this book come alive and who put a human face on this problem, just the way John McDonald did a few minutes ago here. One of those people is Alexandra Morton. I hope she's a familiar name to all of you. She should be. Alex has devoted her entire life. She's a marine biologist. She has devoted her entire adult life to this issue, to protecting the killer whales that feed on wild salmon, to protecting wild salmon themselves, and to fighting the diseases and sea lice and viruses that are spread by the salmon farms on the coast of British Columbia. Alex's singular achievement, in our view, was a court case that she filed against British Columbia in 2010. In 2012, a judge in that case agreed with Alex and her lawyer, Greg McDade, that fish farms were not farms, they were fisheries. And as fisheries, they should be regulated by the federal government. That means DFO, for all of its warts. That means DFO, not the provinces. We feel like that's an issue that needs to be brought to the attention here. Somebody needs to take that to court out here, because it's quite clear, the evidence is positive, that the maritime provinces have done a crap job of regulating this industry. If you look at Newfoundland, where Kathy just, thank you, where Kathy just gave you those mortality statistics. What has the Newfoundland government done? Half the fish that are ever put in those farms die before they can be harvested. Half of them every year. It's millions of fish. What has Newfoundland done? They've expanded. They've expanded the fish. They'd opened 100 kilometers of the southwestern shore now to Grieg, another Norwegian company. Maui, which we think is one of the really bad actors in this business, plans now, with the government's okay, to open six farms near Burgeo in Newfoundland, 6 farms with up to 1 million fish in each farm. I mean, what's going on here? Why can't the province stop this? Why would they double down on something that's working so poorly? I promised I wasn't going to get too excited here. I'm sorry. Another person who was influential in our book and is a success story who should be, I think, a model for you, and that's a guy named Kurt Beardsley. Kurt's from Washington State, and he created an organization called the Wild Fish Conservancy. They have used science and public outrage to get salmon farms out of the waters of Washington State. This happened after a massive collapse of a Cook aquaculture farm in Puget Sound in 2017. Kurt had been at this issue for more than 20 years by then, so he was well placed to do it. And he used, as I said, he harnessed public outrage, and people were really angry about the release of up to 300,000 alien Atlantic salmon into the waters of their Pacific salmon, which are already under great threat. But he also had the science to back it up. He had the science, and that was really important. So the legislature in Washington State, at the push of the Wild Fish Conservancy and 100,000 people who signed Kurt's petition, at their push, the legislature passed a law banning non-native fish farms in their waters, and the governor signed it into law. But Kurt went a step further. He filed a lawsuit against Cook Aquaculture for violating the U.S. Clean Water Act, among other things. And I should say that Washington State investigators found that the collapse of that Cook farm was through Cook's negligence. They had not cleaned the farm properly for weeks and weeks. So Kurt won $2.75 million in that lawsuit. Cook settled it and paid off that money, and it went to rehabilitate wild salmon in Washington State and to try and fix some of the problems that these salmon farms had created. I mean, and Kurt is a model, and for those of you who are really interested in this issue, you know, he'll be willing to help, and the new executive director of that group, Anna Halverson, would be willing to help too, and we'll be happy to put you in touch with them. Closer to home, we hooked up with Sid, who's sitting back there somewhere. There's Sid, and with Jeff. And they were instrumental in turning Hello Nova Scotia into Goodbye Nova Scotia when it came to Cermak. In those meetings, we attended almost all of them, And those meetings were instrumental in pushing Cermak out of here. They tried to cover themselves by saying, well, they couldn't find enough sites to justify a presence here. Baloney. Baloney. They've mapped out more than 20 sites, and they would have worked. But it was you people, it was your opposition that drove them out of here. And that was really important. Now, in Newfoundland, when we went up there on 2 of our research trips, we met amazing people. Amazing people. That's no surprise for anybody who knows Newfoundland. One of them was a fisherman named Gary Snook. Gary left high school at 16 and went to work on a cod fisher out on the Grand Banks. And then when that closed down, he became an inshore fisher. And what he had seen since the salmon farms began popping up along the coast, southern coast of Newfoundland, he lives in Harbor Breton, what he found was the lobsters were disappearing. The scallops were disappearing. The herring were disappearing. And they were being killed off or driven off by these salmon farms. And Gary wanted to speak out about it. But his neighbors and his friends and his family said, keep your mouth shut. And that's what often happens in these remote areas because people depend on these jobs. These salmon farmers are smart in some of the areas where they locate. They know that those jobs are really important, and governments are short-sighted enough to accept that argument. But Gary didn't keep his mouth shut. Gary took his lobster boat, and he took a CBC crew out to see that die-off that we had the photos of, the salmon guts being spewed out of the salvage ships. He took a CBC crew out there, and that CBC footage really changed the conversation among many people in Newfoundland. Unfortunately, the government didn't change at all. They embraced this issue. So, Gary is one of the real unsung heroes of this. And then there's our friend, Yvonne Chouinard, who has showed the world that you can do good and you can do well at the same time. And there's no one who has a greater commitment to the oceans and to getting rid of open net salmon farms than Yvonne Chouinard. Now, you may remember that a few days ago, he gave away his $3 billion company. He gave it to a trust dedicated to combating climate change. And Yvonne has a reputation and a bully pulpit that not many of us have. But he's also an example who shows you can do good and you can do well at the same time. Thank you very much.
Okay, you guys. Okay, as Doug said, we started off by trying to reach out to the industry, to all the major players, and they refused to speak to us. And we couldn't figure out why, because normally it's smart to talk to reporters about something. Even if you think they're going to take a route you don't like, at least you get to have your own say. You get to respond to questions about specific instances or specific research papers, SEC filings, litigation. No, silence. So we realized that this stonewalling was simply part of the company's strategy. Throughout its evolution, the industry has controlled the narrative, and this is how they do it. They know about the environmental impact of their farms. They know they're siting these feedlots close to shore, often on the routes for migration, salmon migration. They see the trash pile up on the fjords of Newfoundland. They know what chemicals they're using to treat the twin plagues of sea lice and the disease at the farms in Europe, in Canada, the US, and in Chile. They know they're taking wild fish for feed, forage fish taken right off the plates of families in West Africa. So instead of speaking with independent journalists, they get the word out through their own captive press, the bought and paid for science, and when all that fails, they use a marketing strategy of burying or attacking the real science and the scientists. And this has been true since the very beginning. In 2004, one of the very first papers came out in Science magazine. It was the very first major peer-reviewed academic study raising questions about the high level of PCBs in farmed salmon and other contaminants too. And the industry fought back. They accused the researchers of having an anti-pollution agenda. Who on earth has a pro-pollution agenda? Other researchers have run headlong into the industry and paid a price. There was Claudette Bethune, who was an American scientist, researcher, who fell in love with a Norwegian and moved to Norway to be with him. And this was not long after the Science magazine article was published. And in Norway, she went to work for something called the National Institute of Nutrition and Seafood. And it was there that she discovered very high levels. Actually, the tip came from the Russians, believe it or not. She discovered high levels of cadmium in farm salmon and took her findings to her supervisor. The response was immediate. She was fired, and the government and the industry also responded. Norway's Seafood Export Council, which is a quasi-government agency responsible for promoting the salmon farming industry, actually accused her of acting as a fifth columnist, which is really a fraught accusation in a country where thousands of people collaborated with Germany during its occupation of Norway. She lost her job, and she returned to the United States without the boyfriend. And so while Maui and Cook and Cermak all refused to respond to our questions or to request for interviews with them or any of their employees, they were happy, since the book has come out, to criticize us. And they've challenged some of the assertions in the book. For instance, the head of Canada's Aquaculture Association challenges the existence of the photo of the yardstick. She said it's fake news. It's not a real photo. So we tracked down the woman who took it and confirmed, yes, she took it, and where she took it, and when. And then we pulled the Nova Scotia records for the licensing of that farm, and it was a salmon farm. They also pushed back against our assertion that these cages are crowded. They said that the salmon in their cages occupy only 4% of the space. I thought, you've seen photos of salmon farms. How did they come up with that number? It made no sense. So it took me a while, finally found an academic paper that talked about stocking at 4% of the capacity of a cage. You know why? Because they were measuring smolts, which are 5 to 8 centimeters long. And if you look at Cook's own applications, its own leases, they're stocking their farms with smolts at 150 grams on average. Well, those fish grow up to be 5 or 6 kilograms. That's about 60-70% capacity in the cage. So yeah, I would say that's crowded. It was PETA that said that the state of these salmon farms is like throwing 27 full-size salmon in your bathtub. That's crowded. There was a former vice president of Exxon Oil, and he described this very same technique years ago when he was talking to his colleagues about how to promote the fossil fuel business. He said, your objective is to wrap yourself in the good phrases while sticking all your opponents with all the bad ones. And by the way, that was the guy who invented the editorial, those propaganda pieces that masquerade as real news. So with that in mind, just take a look at the company websites. Moe claims that its goal is, part of our mission is to lead the blue revolution and to sustainably produce more food from the ocean to feed a growing world population. And Cook says, protecting the ocean has always been essential to our business. We understand that feeding these future generations depends on what we do today, and we're dedicated to our role as environmental stewards. Okay. Sarcasm was intended.
I'm going to pick up with that Cook quote about protecting the oceans and tell you what BS that is. And I'm going to tell you a story here. It started at the end of 2009 off Deer Island in the Bay of Fundy. Bryant Green and his son Derek went out to their lobster car that morning, the December morning, as they often did. They had a month's worth of lobster in that car. For anybody who doesn't know, it's a cage that floats that's suspended mostly under the water to keep the lobsters alive. They can collect them and then take them to the wholesaler. Well, when the Greens got to their lobster car, normally they pull the lobster up and they're, making all those crazy lobster movements. Well, these lobsters were mostly dead or dead-like. And it turned out that the whole car was dead. And so he didn't know what had happened. So he took them into shore to the wholesaler. The wholesaler couldn't sell them. It was a month's worth of work in a 3-month lobster season. So they're looking at a really hard problem here. They called up the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. DFO lagged it to Environment Canada, as they should have. And Environment Canada's investigator, Robert Robichaud, said, put them on ice, I'll come down and get them. So he went down and picked up these lobsters. He happened to be in the neighborhood because, lo and behold, 4 other lobster fishers had had exactly the same problem. They had their lobsters dying. And this is not the first time. Ask Stuart Lamont. For any of you who don't know Stuart, get to know him. Read his lobster report. He lost 110,000 pounds of lobsters in 1996 in one die-off. They were in cages in his business. He lost them all. Well, he lost them for the same reason, it turned out, that the Greens lost theirs and the other 4 fishermen lost theirs. And that was because someone had been using a banned neurotoxin called cypermethrin to fight sea lice in their salmon farms. So the Environment Canada began an investigation. It lasted a full year. They tested the salmon at every farm in the Bay of Fundy to try and find the source. Where do you think they found that source? At 15 different farms run by Cook Aquaculture in their own backyard. Cook was founded in Blacks Harbor, and they're poisoning lobsters in their own backyard. And it's not just lobsters, it's krill, it's every other crustacean, it's the lobster eggs. This neurotoxin breaches the brain-blood separation there and paralyzes fish, and it paralyzes crustaceans. So Environment Canada investigated this out. They raided all the Cook offices in New Brunswick. They gathered material. They spent a year going through that material, and then they brought charges, criminal charges, for violating the Federal Fisheries Act against Glenn Cook, the founder of Cook Aquaculture, and 2 of his chief executives, because they found that the cypermethrin, which is banned here, had been smuggled in by Cook from a place in Maine where they bought it at a pet and feed store. They smuggled it in. And so Glenn Cook and 2 executives are facing 19 criminal charges. Each one carries up to 3 years in prison and a $1 million penalty. Another year goes by, folks. And what happens? Kelly Cove Salmon, a subsidiary of Cook Aquaculture, shows up in court in St. Stephen one day, and they plead guilty to 2 charges of violating the Fisheries Act. They agree to pay a $500,000 fine. $500,000 is not close to $19 million. And all the charges against Glenn Cook and the other 2 executives are dropped. And you know what else happened? After that, the court record was sealed. There was a very short agreed statement of facts that was released that just gave the bare bones of what happened. We got really lucky, and we had someone hand over hundreds and hundreds of pages of files from those court records to us. And that's how, in chapter 3, called Poisoning Your Backyard, we are able to track down this whole story. You know, and that is your neighbor out here at Saddle. That's your neighbor down in Liverpool. That's who wants to expand all of their fish farms here. And that's, can we go to another picture here? I hope it's the right one. I talked a little bit about this before, about the salmon farm in Puget Sound that belonged to Cook that collapsed. This is what happened as that pen was collapsing. And then after it collapsed, Chris, the next slide, please. Oh. This is what those nets looked like. They pulled the nets up out of the water. Those are supposed to be nets that allow the water to flow through, so these pens filled with hundreds of thousands of fish can move with the tides and the currents. Nothing's moving through that. It becomes a sail because for several weeks their cleaning machine had been down and they had not cleaned those nets. And that's how the Washington State investigators concluded that Cook was guilty of negligence in the collapse of this farm. And that's how they were fined $322,000 in Washington and lost some of their leases. Now, there's your neighbor, folks.
For the record, one guy did get convicted on the Cook case with the cypermethrin. It's the little guy who owned the pet feed store in Maine. He was convicted and paid a $5,000 fine. Yeah. So, I was listening to my hero Laura Lynch the other day, one of her podcasts, and this was about the Montreal Protocol, the international treaty that went into effect in 1989. Thank you. It was designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the production of CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons gases that are common in refrigerators, air conditioners, and aerosol sprays. Oh, we have a picture of the ozone layer hole. This is a groundbreaking treaty that has protected the ozone layer and all of us on Earth for more than 30 years. And the science behind the CFCs, which drove the public policy, was very complex. But despite that, the world did come together to eliminate these things because science was able to bring together sources from all over and use the facts, the evidence, the science to drive policy. And one of those scientists was a young woman named Susan Salmon, who stood on top of a building in Antarctica and measured moonbeams late at night in order to document for the first time the actual hole in the ozone. And the negotiations and the ultimate success of this agreement, I think, offer three important lessons for dealing with the environmental damage caused by open net pen salmon farms. She described how they brought together the scientific, the political, and the business communities collaboratively to work on these problems. First, she said the problem has to have a personal impact. Well, CFCs were used by all of us, you know, hairspray, deodorant, that sort of thing. Farm salmon is eaten by many of us. It is the most popular fish today in North America. Second, people need to be, according to the scientists, people need to see the problem. The photographs eventually that were produced of the hole in the ozone layer were broadcast on the evening news, terrified people. It's a little more difficult with salmon farms because we see these pretty pictures of the net pens reflecting the blue of the sky. What you need to see is what is below the ground, below the water line, and that's what's really frightening. That's what's going to drive change, and that's why we wrote this book and created the website where we have photographs of this. And third, I was struck most by Solomon's third point, which was that the scientific community and the various governing bodies recognized that the industry needed to be part of the solution. There's no doubt that the companies producing those CFCs were facing enormous change, as is the aquaculture business today. The choice then and now should be to engage industry, be part of the change, otherwise it's just going to be forced on them. The solution to the damage done by the open net farms exists. Industry needs to be at the negotiating table to share the solutions. Just as wild salmon are adapting, we just learned recently that wild salmon are now migrating as far north as the Arctic. The industry has to adapt or become extinct itself. We are not anti-aquaculture. We are simply against aquaculture as it's done today, the wrong way. Do it the right way. Embrace the new emerging technologies like the RAS systems that Simon mentioned, and make it better, whether it's land-based or something else. Thank you.
It's almost like a collection of stories. You know, you might think a book like this would be very, very dry, but you tell the particular stories of individuals along with the narrative, and that makes it very compelling for somebody like me who is more interested in people, perhaps, than facts sometimes, you know. So I really do appreciate the book in that way. I guess my first question is, either of you can take it on, but so in reporting this book, what was the biggest surprise? Or a couple of surprises?
The biggest surprise for us, I think, if I may speak for you too, thank you. You have to be careful. This is the 7th book we've written together, and it requires a certain delicacy, particularly on my part. Anyway.
If you believe that.
Our biggest surprise was the fact that informed, smart people don't know anything about the salmon they're eating. They don't know where it came from. The labels don't tell them anything. You may, if you're lucky, have a label that says fresh Atlantic salmon and then in smaller print farmed. But what does that mean? What does farmed mean? You know, people just don't know. And that was a surprise. And that really is the driving force for us behind this book, particularly in the final third where we talk about recirculating aquaculture systems, which are the land-based systems that Simon talked about in the beginning, where we talk about that as an alternative. and they produce fish. The two plants here in Nova Scotia, it's all the salmon we eat now. There is an alternative here, but that alternative is going to come to be only if consumers demand it. Only if consumers get together and work collectively to demand that, and only if we can force governments to impose transparency and accountability on this industry. And we have a kind of simple solution. You see QR codes on most of the products you buy. Why couldn't you have a QR code on that package of salmon? Aim your smartphone at it, see where it came from. See if it came from a clean farm. There are not very many. They should all be out of the ocean. But see if it came from a cleaner one that didn't use chemicals, or see if, as 50% of this farmed salmon in the United States does, came from Chile, where they use pesticides and chemicals and antibiotics in great quantities.
And I'd like to add to that.
Thank you.
Okay. The labeling is an issue because it just doesn't exist in Canada or the U.S. It's a little, some European countries are a little better, but Doug has a little thing he does with his former workmates at the New York Times where they have chat. Thursdays? Anyway, so one of these guys thought he had the answer to find good Atlantic salmon because he had heard of a new place called Cutler Cove in Maine. And we thought the only people farming salmon in Maine, that's Cook. Yeah. This is really weird. Is there some little farm we don't know about producing high-end salmon? You look at the website, it says ocean-raised salmon. What does that mean? And premium salmon. So it was really late at night. But anyway, I got intrigued and found the leases. Those are all Cook leases. But even Cook recognizes they got a little bit of a brand problem, and they're renaming their salmon something else in order to conceal the fact that it's Cook. But this salmon is Cutler Cove and ocean raised.
Ocean raised.
Ocean raised.
Are there other places in the world that have better labeling and where people know where their fish is coming from?
Yeah. When we shop, and we lived at the last place we lived was in Paris, and we go down to the fishmonger and we could ask what country it came from, whether or not it was farmed or wild, and how it was harvested, what day it was harvested, whether things are, well, not for salmon, but whether or not fish are line caught or scooped up. And yes, there's a lot more information in other places.
Yeah, the European Union is better. Yeah. It's not great, but it's better.
And there is an argument that people are ready for this sort of information. The Living Oceans and Sea Choice in Canada are working very hard at water-to-plate transparency, I think, trying to force the government to come up to what it committed to a few years ago. In the States, the EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, did a survey within the last year, and more than 70% of consumers want their salmon to be raised properly, sustainably, in a healthy manner, and they want to know what they're buying, and they're willing to spend more money for it. So consumers are ready.
Yeah, but it seems like the industry does kind of control the narrative, because if you ask your average Nova Scotian consumer, they probably have no idea where their fish comes from, and if they listen to Cook and all, they probably think it's perfectly good fish.
Raised in the ocean.
A member of the Parliament of Canada was in St. John's, Newfoundland in August. They had the World Aquaculture Conference there, and he told the audience, he said, I was meeting with 50 of my colleagues in Parliament, and I asked them how many knew that the salmon they ate was farmed, and he said 5 raised their hands. These are presumably informed people, maybe not so much, some of them, but they were clueless. They were clueless.
Okay, one last question for me, and then I'll open up. So thank you so much for praising the initiative here to keep Cermak out. Is there another success story around the world that you could cite for us to be inspirational? You did cite a few earlier, but...
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard, folks. It's really hard. We don't mean to underestimate this challenge by any stretch. I mean, Cermak and what you did with Cermak is a great success story. What Kurt Beardsley and the Wild Fish Conservancy did in Washington State was of enormous consequence. After that, it gets very, very hard, very hard.
Well, interestingly though, the Norwegians have better controls of their industry, right? They have a red light, green light system. They impose penalties when the sea lice infestations get too bad. Your stocking limits are based on how healthy your fish are. So the Norwegians are doing some of these things
They're actually regulating.
a little better than we are, yeah. You pay a lot of money for a lease in Norway. You don't, I believe the lease is on land if you were brave enough to do that in Norway, or free. Is that right, Simon?
Yes, they are free.
I think they're
We
free.
know that. We don't have to ask him.
We don't need to ask Simon. But another funny thing about the Norwegians, so a Norwegian parliamentarian visited Canada. His name? Because I always forget his name.
John Lillerton.
John, this is a name I was sorry. Doug knew where I was going with this. He visited Canada in 1992.
Yes.
And he was talking to the relevant parliamentary commission here, and he said that, oh, here's a quote, "We are very strict about the quality and environmental questions. Therefore, some of the fish farmers went to Canada. They said, we want bigger fish farms. We can do as we like. That is a very hot subject, I think." So Canadians can't say the Norwegians didn't warn them.
So we got about 10 minutes. There must be some questions out there, I'm sure. I'll just look for a hand or something. If there aren't any, I'll keep asking.
No. Yes, Jeff?
You're not the one.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nova Scotia is currently undergoing this regulatory review that Simon mentioned, and it's just the regulations are so frustrating to deal with. I don't know whether you two have had a chance to look at them and form any opinions about them. One particular frustration we have is the farm management plans. When they go before the Agriculture Review Board to seek a license, they promise to deliver a farm management plan, which includes stocking and so forth. But the public can't, that's proprietary. The public cannot see what they're promising to do, and therefore cannot police and require that. I wonder if you share any frustrations with the Nova Scotia regulations that you care to.
I'm going to be very calm here and say, you're damn right we do. I mean, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, where they have a lot of these fish farms, as Simon showed, in New Brunswick, if you have a fish escape from your farms, you have to report it to the government, and that's a transparent public document. You can get it in New Brunswick. You have to report sea lice infestations in New Brunswick. You can get it. You have to do the same thing in Norway. In Norway, they regulate the salmon farms according to the number of sea lice. Here in Nova Scotia, you have to report to the government, but that is proprietary information. It's private. We don't know that. They're operating in the dark, and this government protects them and allows them to. We gave a talk down in Sandy Cove and Digby Neck, it's way down there, a couple of weeks ago, and they're pretty upset because, as Simon pointed out, they've got some big fish farms that are coming in there. They already have salmon farms, and they're very concerned. And the moderator there was this great guy, Arthur Bull, for any of you who know him or remember him when he used to be somebody like us. He said that we view ourselves as a sacrifice zone, as a place where we're not listened to. And on this questionnaire that the government sent out, asking people to comment on their regulations, and you check a region, Digby Neck, Sandy Cove, Digby wasn't even a region. They had to count themselves as part of the South Shore. And read this quote, Kathy. This is the killer. This is the killer.
We don't know about the regulations because we can't see them, but it was interesting to us that the premiers, in advance of the public comment period, released a statement that says, quote,
This is the 4 premiers of the maritime provinces,
yes,
including our own.
"While the federal government has responsibility managing Canada's fisheries, the aquaculture sector is well managed under the provincial regulation of this region. Premiers are wholeheartedly committed to maintaining the existing system for licensing and overseeing aquaculture operations in Atlantic Canada." You feel like you just wasted 15 minutes filling out those forms?
Yeah.
There was a question here.
So how do we, the ordinary people, fight that? what do we do? What is the best way? How do we proceed?
Hire a lawyer, raise money and hire a lawyer and fight this. Get out in the street. I mean, we saw some great photos up there of people protesting, and organize, have meetings like this. I mean, how did you get rid of Cermak? Boy, some of those meetings got a little testy. We were in one over at the fire hall in Blandford, and toward the end of that, Lobsterman stood up and said, you know, we don't want you here, and when we don't want people here, bad things happen. Sometimes boats get burned.
And he's not advocating this, by the way.
No, I'm not. But, you know, people were really exercised because they saw their livelihoods threatened. And this is a threat. It's a threat to your livelihoods. It's a threat to lobstermen. It's a threat to other fishers. And it's a threat to tourism. It's a threat to our environment. It's a threat to the reason we all live here. Catherine is from Cape Breton. So I came along for the ride, and I've loved this place. We've been here for 5 years full time, and we've been coming here for 30 years. You know, but you've got to fight. You've got to organize, and Healthy Bays Network and Twin Bays and the Council of Canadians are part of that fight. But you know what we see is people around the province getting together in opposition, but government's turning a deaf ear to this. So we've really got to find a way to get their attention. And the way Kurt Beardsley did it out in Washington State, where he also had some brave senators in the state legislature. There was a guy named, it's interesting, there was a guy named Kevin Ranker, and Kevin had introduced legislation in 2014 to ban salmon farms in the waters of Puget Sound, and it went nowhere. After the collapse of that Cook farm, Kevin reintroduced his legislation with the support of the Wild Fish Conservancy, Kurt Beardsley, and the support of 100,000 people across Washington State, and it passed. It zoomed through. The Republicans tried to fool with it, but mostly they didn't, and Governor Inslee signed it. And so you have no more non-native fish farms in the waters of Washington State.
And Simon raises a good point. This is your space. This is your ocean. This is a public asset. This is not a private asset. This is yours.
I saw a question over here. Actually, I think it was this fellow right here.
To add insult to injury, when I read your book, I was astounded to find out that the governments that are supposed to be watching over these farms are compensating the farms for the loss of fish as a result of their bad practices. Could you speak a little bit to this and what the magnitude of it is?
Yeah, it's worth noting, we weren't real clear about this in the book, they stopped that practice in 2016. But up until then, they would compensate farmers who under the federal program, they would compensate farmers like they were salmon farmers like they were real farmers. You know, you get a frost on your strawberry crop, you can't control that, and you get compensated by the government. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But you introduce something like infectious salmon anemia to your fish farm down in Shelburne County, and 1 million fish die, and you haul them out at midnight in the back of some big trucks so nobody sees it, and then the government pays you $13 million for bringing that virus in eggs from New Brunswick. But so there was an outcry. The Ecology Action Center played a big role in forcing that issue. They drew up charts, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, and I tell you, the Atlantic Salmon Federation people do great work. They really do great work on this issue. You know, they brought this to the attention of the governments, and the governments finally shut that program down, as they should have long before.
I think Meryl might have the last word. I'm not sure. We'll see if we can come back to you.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, Meryl. I saw you first.
I don't know anything about inland farms and how they work, but, and it's too big a discussion to have now, but would it be a good idea to encourage our government to incent people to create these farms? The inland farms?
The land-based farms.
The land-based farms. I'm not sure how they work, and I'd be curious to know that at some other time.
You got to read the book, Meryl.
Well, I didn't finish the book.
Well, you'll get there then.
But I was just thinking that this woman was saying, what could we do? Is there a way that we can work in the Council of Canadians or a group of people to encourage incentivizing land-based farming?
You could do that in a way, because land-based farms, the Ross farms, have to buy their own land. They have to build their own buildings. They have to pay for their own energy. They have to build all the equipment, the complicated computer systems that keep these fish alive in all their conditions in, in an ideal setting. But the open net pens farms are freeloaders on a public asset. So when you start, yes, if you supported land-based facilities, if that is in fact the answer, to the same degree that the open net farms have been supported, it would help even the field a little bit.
You can also vote with your pocketbook on this.
Yeah, there was an article a few months ago about Sobeys carrying sustainable blue in Halifax. I went into the store in Bridgewater and asked them, they said, oh, not here, they do it in Halifax. Struck me as rather odd, but you were saying you had seen it in Bridgewater.
I only buy it from Kelly, but I did see it in Bridgewater one day.
So
it was the whole fish.
So we need to be asking, I guess. Okay, I think we have time for one last question over here.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I heard this right. You had mentioned that out on the West Coast that there was a case that went to court and the judge agreed with the plaintiff that these were fisheries and not farms.
Right.
Well, the first question is, the big corporation, I mean, fish farms have been around for years, decades.
3,000 years.
But was the farm, that name, chosen deliberately to keep it under the provincial government?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Because that was before.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was that clever.
Because they started in Norway.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
They started in Norway.
Right.
The salmon
Okay,
farms.
so here in Canada, if that case was decided on the West Coast, that they should be regulated as fisheries, or they should be called fisheries, and therefore regulated by the federal government, why didn't that just take off all the way across the country?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, it should, but Kathy just read you the statement from the 4 premiers out here. You know, they want control. They don't want to give up sovereignty. And you know what? The federal government doesn't really want this hot button issue either. They really don't. It's one where they can feel like they can lose votes. I mean, the Maritimes are important to the Liberals, and they don't want to upset some of the people, some of the big players here in the Maritimes. And so they're not. So the federal government's not beating down the door here in Halifax or in St. John's to take this over. They're going to have to be forced. Somebody's going to have to go to court, like Alex Morton did, and force them to do this. And it was a Supreme Court justice in British Columbia who decided this. And, you know, it should be, just for constitutional consistency, it should be the policy across the whole country.
You can get to the complaint online.
And has it made a difference out there?
Yes, it has. It has. British Columbia was in danger of becoming the next Chile. There are mostly Norwegian firms out there, Cermaq, Maui. If you'll remember, the folks from BC came out here and talked about the problems they had with Cermaq when it was in play here. So it was Cermaq, Maui, and Grieg are the big players out there, and they were prepared to get even bigger. But DFO has, at least for now, slowed that down a little bit. They've refused to renew some licenses in the Discovery Islands, which is a key transit point for sockeye salmon, which have been in dramatic decline, facing extinction. So they've slowed it down there. But that said, last week, the DFO approved a 125% increase in Cermaq's salmon production in British Columbia. I mean, they promised to get them out of the water. They promised to transition. That doesn't sound like a transition to me, so you really got to watch it. In 2019, the Liberals' platform said that we would have them out of the water by 2025. Well, Now, we're hoping to have a plan in place in the next 2 years to transition them out of the water. But this industry is clever, they've got a lot of money, they spend a lot of money, and they have that one card that's hard for us to play, and that's jobs. You know, they point to jobs. There's not very many jobs. You know how many people it takes to run the salmon farm in Liverpool Bay? 7. 7. That's it. They're sitting in an office in Bridgewater, across from the Subaru dealer, and they're running it by
We just
computers.
found it yesterday.
So Marilyn, it is 9:02, and I know we try to do things on time here.
Right, I think we should wrap up. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Catherine and Doug again for the wonderful, amazing work you've done on this issue. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Simon and John, for your participation. And thank all the volunteers who make this event possible. You can help sign up with the Twin Bays Network or the Council of Canadians. That way you're kept in the loop and be kept informed. You should be talking to your elected officials
If you wish.
about this issue. And stay tuned. I, for one, have hope. I think that we can do it, but the only way we can do it is if we organize from the grassroots. They see votes, and they serve along this. The Conservatives could lose 4 seats if we organize just from Chester, Lunenburg West, and Queens. And if we organize and those seats are threatened, they may pay attention. So let's get out there and do it.
Where should people leave their pledge cards?
Leave their pledge cards,
They can give them to me.
okay. Give them to Jeff. And I think, unfortunately, it is true. We do need money, and we do need to hire lawyers to fight this. So I don't like it one little bit, but I think it's part of it. So, okay, thank you very much.